Now we're going to begin talking about lactate, and lactate over the years has been considered the bad guy with muscle contraction, fatigue. But we're going to look at it from a different perspective and how George Brooks and his group up at Berkeley have begun to make lactate and lactic acid as a guy that we utilize as energy quite a bit. So glycolysis is the anaerobic pathway used to transfer bond energy from glucose to rejoin the phosphagen ion and ADP into adenosine triphosphate. This occurs in the sarcoplasm of the cell, with the end products determining the next location of processing. Pyruvate transferred directly across the mitochondria, while lactate must be converted in the sarcoplasm. They are both then converted into acetyl coenzyme A, and then that's where they enter the Krebs cycle and create the ATP. Now, the creation of pyruvate versus lactate is dependent upon the presence of the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. That's the NAD. So this image right here, this is from Laura Ruding. It depicts the metabolic pathways for carbohydrate and fat. Now, as stated in previous lecture, the muscle is unlike the liver, and it's has the inability to produce glucose for usage, immediate glucose for usage. So instead, the byproduct or the products of muscle metabolism are either the pyruvate or lactate, and then the pyruvate enters the Krebs cycle immediately, while lactate has one of two destinations. It can either enter the bloodstream and be shuttled to other organs of the body, or it can enter the mitochondria through some other processes, and ultimately the Krebs cycle for energy production. So we're going to first talk about oxidant-independent glycolysis, and this is the production of ATP without the presence of oxygen. However, the production of pyruvate is dependent upon the presence of oxygen at the end of the process. The oxygen dependence portion of this pathway is the process that leads up to the final stages of the production. And the pathway steps are glycogen in the muscle is converted to lactate without the presence of oxygen. If oxygen was there, again, it would go into pyruvate, directly enter the mitochondria and enter the Krebs cycle. Here, then, the production of ATP continues to replenish itself in the active muscle. Lactate is transported across the mitochondrial membrane, where it is converted to acetyl coenzyme A, and then it enters the Krebs cycle to continue to produce ATP. And again, this is a very rapidly acting process at high intensities. So lactate must be converted into acetyl coenzyme A to enter the Krebs cycle. And again, just so you're aware, this is a little depiction, a little schematic of glycolysis in the pyruvate and acetyl enzyme A. And again, remember, you can have lactate just being right up there as well, going into the acetyl coenzyme A and then going that way. So some factors that determine lactate production. So the rate of glycolysis, the rapid is the rate of NADH production. Now this may exceed the transport capacity of the shuttle mechanism. So going back and forth that hydrogen ion from the sarcoplasm to mitochondria. If the production is higher than NADH, then it can't take enough of those mechanisms. So think about the mitochondria. Think about the cell membrane of the mitochondria, and there's only a certain number of these mechanisms there. Now, there's also the enzymatic process, the catalyst that converts pyruvate to lactate. So that's lactate dehydrogenase. Now this is where we get into the controversy. So it's type specific to the fiber type. So this is LDH. So LDH does have individual isoforms, or however you want to call them, that are related to the fiber type. So slow twitch convert pyruvate to lactate easily, where fast twitch fibers, it's a slower conversion. Now, some of the work that Brooks may contradict us a little bit. I just read some things from his over the last couple of weeks that may start to say that there's really no difference, though, In the conversion, it's just the speed at which the conversion is done between the two fiber types. And again, this is if you believe in there's a difference in fiber types, but there's that for you as well. So now the rate of removal of the lactate from the bloodstream during incremental exercise, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but this is a lot of Brooks's work talking about the difference between trained and untrained individuals. It's not the production of lactate, but the rate at which we can take the lactate from the blood. So there's some little equations for you down at the bottom. So the concentration of blood lactate is not only just the amount that enters, but also the amount that's removed. So the creation or the production of, and then the removal of. And it happens to look like blood lactate removal is where trained individuals are more advanced than untrained, not in the actual production of. So these are just a couple of the graphs that are presented in Noakes's book on lactate production on the y-axis, in time or intensity on the x-axis. And so what you see is up in the left corner, heavy, very heavy or moderate intensity exercise, and it's either rowing or running. I don't remember what it is, but you can see how the production really increases the higher, the heavier the weight, or the heavier the intensity is. The wattage on the one on the bottom is the same thing as the intensity level. And that equation there is the concentration of blood lactate, or change of, is a component of RA is the rate of creation, and RD is the rate of removal from the blood. I don't know what the constant is, but that is a constant, and maybe that is the workload. But 300 watts is the highest workload, and you can see how there's a greater slope to that line, but it also has a greater concentration. So let's go over the class review, and this is pretty much probably what everybody in the class has thought about with lactate, but it's a metabolite or a byproduct of glycolysis. Now, it's thought of to be a poisonous byproduct of the exercise and skeletal muscle. Lactic acid production. Now, this acidosis is that pH balance of the exercise and skeletal muscle, and that's where it's been related to cramping and the side stitches. Oxygen debt relation is mainly related to the ease of measurement, because you can take a little blood draw and see that it's raised. But again, blood concentration does not show you the production and the removal. And then the post-exercise lactate is converted to glucose in the liver, which creates that elevated post-exercise oxygen uptake. Now, I was just again reading some stuff from Brooks, and this is what a lot of this work that we're talking about comes from George Brooks and his group up at Berkeley, that Tim Noakes is taking a lot of his work from. They are some of the experts on this lactate shuttle concept. But so lactate production only occurred when the oxygen supply was inadequate to meet oxygen demands, right? So when you don't have oxygen, you can't create the pyruvate. Therefore, you're going to create lactic acid, which is very unstable, and immediately encourages to lactate, and then you have the blood lactate because it's transported out to other mechanisms of the body. So this exercise-induced muscle acidosis concept, there's a production of carbon dioxide and carbonic acid in the skeletal muscle, right? So therefore, there's an increase in pH balance, and it's thought through the increased concentration of the hydrogen ion. Lactate, not the lactic acid, again because lactic acid is very unstable, is the presence as a byproduct. The acidity comes from the hydrogen ion produced from the glycolytic ATP turnover. Here's a little depiction of a couple of metabolisms, processes, the hydrogen ion. But again, so hydrogen ion from the ATP break down into ADP. All right, you ready to have your mind blown? Here you go. Boom! The new view. Lactate, the key end product of glycolysis. Now, what does that mean, right? So, it is no longer thought of as this enemy. It's now thought of as the key component. Well, it's a metabolite that is created at the site of a working muscle that can be then reconverted into energy at the same site. Well, that reduces the need to transfer via blood or anything else, another substrate to create this energy. Amazing, right? So now have a production, it turns around, creates it into uh, lactate, which through some processes can enter into the mitochondria of the working skeletal muscle, transfer into acetyl-CoA A through some series of enzymatic processes, enter into the mitochondria, and create that Krebs cycle energy. Boom. High energy substrate, here you go. So the rate of production increases based on your intensity of exercise. So the higher the intensity, the higher this rate of production of lactate is, right? Because generally there's less oxygen at the higher intensities. Oxygen needed to create pyruvate. If you don't have the oxygen, you create lactate. There it is, right? Also, the dependence upon carbohydrate. There's sort of many reasons for this, but again, that's that dependence on the glycogen and glycogen depletion, and this process that saves in lactate uses it, right? And then we also independence on carbohydrate. When there's a lack of oxygen, we increase that dependence upon carbohydrate as the energy source. That is another reason why when you do a VO2 max test or a running economy test, you use RER, because now you're using more carbohydrate or carbon dioxide, which also refers to the carbohydrate usage. So you see how this is all tying in now. But again, so within the body, this is where this confusion happened before, right? Lactic acid, very acidic, creates that pH balance, but its counterpart, its conjugate, is sodium lactate. So it's lactate that's combined with sodium, so it's not as acidic. It's more of a basic in structure, so it doesn't make that acidic process, right? Therefore, it's a product of, not the cause of, muscle contraction. So this contraction creates this process. All right, now this is the first statement for Ninox and stuff, and why they have this new lactate concept, because it's not all about the lack of oxygen in their eyes. Their eyes, you can never have a non-oxygen environment in the system, because their concept of muscle contraction is skeletal muscles cannot contract anaerobically. So there has to be some portion of it, although it may be small and it may be not in big enough portions to convert all of that into pyruvate. Um, but so again, little evidence support the theory that lactate only released by muscles that are anaerobic, or indeed that can ever become anaerobic during exercise. Especially the cardiovascular and the heart muscles. Those things cannot work anaerobically. There has to be some sort of oxygen supply. Now let's talk about kind of an older term. You still hear people throw it around, anaerobic threshold. You'll see a lot of the anaerobic threshold training. But this is thought of as the point when, so it's a measure of blood lactate. And the measure when blood lactate concentration begins to rise in accordance with intensity, often used during graded exercise tests as a marker of they reach their max VO2. Right? So some people, I don't do this, but I know they've done it at UNLV and other schools do it. But during your graded exercise test, during each stage incremental increase, they'll have you step off, take a little blood sample, and they'll measure it so that you know at what point you increased your lactate threshold. And going back to some of the previous lecture during that VO2 max, we talked about that. Or actually, I think it was either the VO2 max for running economy when we talked about the study where they had people perform at a percentage of their speed at lactate, right? So this is what they did. They measured the concentration levels during that graded exercise test, and they identified the speed at which that happened. So historically, this has been associated with the point that skeletal begins anaerobic metabolism. However, it actually truly is just the measure of the balance of lactate formation and clearance, and when they're no longer in balance. So the individual now is creating a greater rate of lactate rather than and not being able to clear it as rapidly. As it's unknown whether skeletal muscle can actually achieve that state of anaerobic metabolism, the lactate threshold is you identify a balanced state and infer the inability to create the pyruvate and clear the produced lactate, which again, going back to a slide prior, is kind of one of those indicators of going more to the carbohydrate metabolism or substrate usage. So these are all in indicators of you've reached a higher intensity level. So the production, um, blood lactate production increases exponentially as intensity increases. And these training values there, so it shows that through training, you can shift the point of lactate production closer to your VO2 max, right? So in untrained, it's 50 to 60%. In trained, anywhere from 65 to 80%, which is killer because that means you can work or run at a faster pace at your marathon without having this buildup of lactate throughout your system. Now, graphically, to calculate the lactate threshold, you're going to use this onset of blood lactate accumulation. So you're going to graph lactate, blood lactate concentration, millimoles per liter, versus the intensity level. So whether you're doing watts or percentage of VO2 max, that's going to be on the x-axis. And that point where you have a change in the slope, right? So there's a sudden spike in the concentration levels. That's the point at which there is the lactate threshold. So it describes the exercise intensity at which a specific blood lactate concentration is reached. So for this person, if they use 4 millimoles, then it's going to be at more like the 65, 70, sorry, like the 70 VO2 max. And so after graphing it, you would say, okay, 70 if it's the 4 millimoles. But for me, I generally use when you have that shift like they do in the graphic layer, when there's that sudden rise, I would say that's the lactate threshold. I think back to that graph on the previous page. So here's that the graphical version of the lactate turn point. But there's also a mathematical version that calculates that slope, right? So the gradient slope of increasing blood lactate levels. So you can do it visually like I just showed you, or you can do it mathematically. You can have your way. I like to do it visually. It's just as easy. But going down to talk about some studies and some early on studies, going back to 1979. But that first one, so Farrell et al. In 1979 found that the velocities that runners were able to maintain for a standard marathon, which is that 42-kilometer marathon, were 0.45 kilometers per hour faster than the treadmill speed that they had the lactate turn point calculated as. So during the speed portion of a VO2 max test, whatever they calculated the lactate turn point, they found that the average runner was able to run at 0.45 kilometers per hour per faster. So that was a great determinant. Another study showed that runners' lactate turn point was related to their training volume, percentage of type 1 muscle fibers, and the capillary density of the running leg muscles. So let's think about that. So the greater concentration of muscle capillaries transfers to a greater speed at which the runner achieved their lactate turn point, which translates to a faster marathon times, right? So these are all kind of concepts that are leading to that anaerobic threshold training or that lactate threshold, right? So in 1984, Tanaka and his group found that the greatest training effect that provided race performances of 5 to 10 kilometers were this increase in intensity of the lactate turn point, or speed at which you achieved your lactate turn point. Now, everything's not without opposition, right? So the people who think lactate turn point is not a good predictor of your races, it's a time-consuming test, right? So doing the VO2 max test and having to stop and do this portion is time-consuming, right? So those of you that know about the VO2 max test we do here, it's not a speed one. These speed tests take a long time, so it's not like I'm trying to get you done with mine in 14, 15 minutes. I don't want you to go longer than that. These sometimes get up to 20, 30 minutes because people can go at pretty beats. And then they say it's not as a good predictor as the velocity at which your VO2 max test happens. The prediction is based on prediction based on previous shorter races, or the athlete's own prediction. If you're an experienced marathoner, with your training and how you're feeling, you can be pretty close to it. So again, this opposition, or the predictors here, people say are better predictors of your race performance or finish times. Um, it, People say it's better used to identify fitness during training, um, as opposed to those performance predictions. And I totally agree with this. I think lactate threshold and turn points are and RERs are great ways to identify the point at which you can work or intensity at which you can work without transferring into the utilization of more of this carbohydrate concept, where you're starting to attack and use energy sources that you don't want to be using. But in this is that concept where training can shift this turn point, right? So the lactate training and those type of things do have benefit. I'm a strong proponent of that, and that would be a great topic for somebody to cover in class. So you've heard me talk a lot about George Brooks. Here he is. And I just wanted to quickly talk about the lactate shuttle. And it started from more of a traumatic brain injury and cancer, and it goes along to exercise as well. But it started with his cancer work, and some of his TBI work that he does as well. But his idea is lactate may be the most important metabolic fuel used by skeletal muscle, especially during exercise, and that's because it's created and utilized in the same working skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscles are actively produced and consumed lactate both at rest and during exercise. So this is not just an exercise, but actually it does increase. Right. So this lactate concept, right? So the mitochondria is the direct transport within the skeletal muscle, or it goes again into the bloodstream, where it's transported to the heart and other skeletal muscles for energy production, or to the liver for conversion to blood glucose. So think about that schematic I showed you a little earlier, where it had the brain, the liver, and some skeletal muscle. So those are the ideas that it can do. So there's two different shuttle mechanisms within its own skeletal muscle directly to the mitochondria for further metabolism and creation of energy through the Krebs cycle, or transferred through the bloodstream into other. And that's where you get the increased blood lactate concentration is through this. So this is a little process of how the increase in lactate blood concentration is explained through the shuttle mechanism. So first off, exercise intensity increases. Your dependence on carbohydrate as your substrate for energy production increases. This increases that glycolytic process. Going back, you can call it the oxygen independent, but as we talked about, there is some oxygen in the process. Increases the lactate production. So this rate of production now is going to exceed the rate at which the exercising muscle can utilize it, and that's probably because of the shuttle mechanisms surrounding the mitochondria are no longer in abundance, or the NAD is not there. Those type of things are going to be what has the rate of utilization increasing beyond what the working exercising muscle can use. So therefore, it's released into the brain, where it's then shuttled, or it increases the blood lactate concentration and then shuttled to other skeletal muscles, heart, and liver for usage or storage. Now, Noakes and Brooks are very strong components that this lactate concept is not um, related to this concept of exhaustion, um, and the limiting factor, right? So this infusion in the bloodstream of the lactate is there to neutralize the hydrogen ions um, during the carbohydrate turnover, right? But low lactate levels that follow the prolonged exercise, which have been measured numerous times, they don't explain this exhaustion seen following marathons and longer distance. So there has to be some other mechanism that we don't know about, right? So for years, because lactate and lactic acid are so easily measurable in blood, they assume that this is the reason. But again, the production is no longer greater. It's just the amount that we can no longer remove it. But it's the lactate concentration portion, not the lactic acid. So it's not as acidic as people thought. Now here shows the two theories based on how lactate is removed from the blood post exercise. So the classical theory was that the post exercise lactate was converted to glucose in the liver, which is an expensive process. It's resulted in the need for the elevated post exercise oxygen uptake. Now, we didn't talk about EPOC in this podcast. We'll talk a little bit about it in class, in some of the ideas behind EPOC. But the old theory is that increase in oxygen above resting is due to the need if to remove the lactate and convert it to glucose to the liver. But the new theory is that the majority of lactate is oxidizing activity converted to pyruvate and used as a substrate in heart and skeletal muscle for energy production. Approximately 70% is oxidized, 20% is then thought to still be converted to glucose, and then another additional that 10% is amino acids. So it's not nearly as costly as once thought. So here is the fate of lactate after an exercise, exhaustive exercise. And I'll just go ahead and look around here, but that shows the big chunk of that pie there is oxidation. You have muscle glycogen and liver, and then you have proteins and amino acid, and then you have some lactate and glucose, less than 2%. Because remember, at rest, you always have some blood lactate available. Or now, this slide, I really want to put this because it's always that warm down period or cool down period at the end, and you want to bring your heart rate down and all those things. But this actually brings some pretty important knowledge to that. So if you go out for a very long run or a nice high intense run and you increase that lactate blood concentration high, this graph here, look at, you can see, so the dark blue is no exercise at all, and then the kind of turquoise or blue green or maybe colorblind, whatever color you guys want that to be, is a very light exercise. So it's more of a jog, right, or relaxed high speed walk at 35% of your max. There's a much greater decrease. You get greater back down to baseline following in recovery time, 40 minutes, versus an elevated still upwards of 5 millimoles at that 40 minutes. So light exercise following reduces or removes that increased blood lactate. Trained athletes remove it quicker. And then there's a return to normal following 1 hour post-intense interval sessions. If you have reached 15 millimoles, it'll take you 1 hour to go back to normal. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in the presentation is this concept of delayed onset muscle soreness. That DOMS. One of the old theories is that lactate was a cause because of these needle-like crystals formed within the muscle that cause the pain the day and 2 days and 3 days following intense or long duration exercise. But it's now known that the cause of DOMS is due to experiencing pain with low levels reduced to normal levels. So this DOMS still occurred even when lactate levels reduced. So that's like saying, hey, dude, this is not causing it. There's something else. And we now know that it's commonly because of tears in the muscle. So if something is related, then you'd still have to have that increase in lactate, those needle-like crystals, to be there for you to still be feeling that pain, but it's just not there. So thanks, guys, for listening. Sorry this one was posted late. It's been crazy, but I will post your quiz. And then what I want to do is, as a recommendation to one of your classmates, so I'm going to bring a couple articles, a couple concepts, and we're going to talk about lactate a little bit more as it relates to exercise in class, and I really want to get some stirring debate. So if you guys have time, try to find some articles or try to find some material on lactate and what it does to performance and whether or not lactate training actually does anything for you. And hopefully we can have some good discussion this week. But have a good week, and I'll see you on Friday.